Is everyone here? Are we waiting?
Yeah, we should be.
No, we're good. Okay, I think we should get started then. Let's see, do we have a motion on the minutes?
So moved.
Second, any discussion?
No.
Okay, all in favor? Great, thank you. Agenda item 1 is New Hampshire statewide assessment results.
Sure, I will be passing out the updated chart with the New Hampshire statewide assessment data. So those will be coming around. I'm gonna have to share, so I'm just gonna put two that way, and two that way, and then share. Each one of the subcommittee members should have their own.
What's that?
I have mine on that file, so I won't be able to read it.
Oh, yeah, very lots of.
Sorry.
I know, it does help.
Well, I can't see.
I know.
It should be in the mail.
No, he's got an extra, there you go.
Yeah. You take that, we'll share.
Anybody wants an extra, we've got a few.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do the Dawn glass, I'll go over the mask under the.
Right?
Yeah,
It's
Just gotta put your glasses down by the end of your nose.
I know,
I
right?
can't see that way there.
Depends on how big your nose is as to whether or not that'll work your bifocals.
Oh, geez.
All right, so this is the same chart that we used for 5 years running now. And you can see that the data is in there from previous years. The 1920 data is in there as COVID because there was no testing in 1920. And so asterisks are used to fill the areas because there were no tests given. The 2021 data has been bolded. And you can see that for the most part across the board, scores have gone down. And it's important to note that the press release that went out earlier this week from the Department of Ed said that participation rates across the state dropped significantly. Only 73,000 students took the assessments. And it was closer to 91,000 the last time we tested, which would have been the 18-19 year. So participation rates went down, numbers went down, scores went down across the board. And the Department of Ed also noted in their press release that went out on Monday that students learning remotely did much more poorly than students who came into class to take their learning in person. So overall, there is a lot of work that has to be done. But as I've said before, learning stopped for everybody globally with the pandemic. This was the first test that students took since we were coming back. And if we can remember back to last year, our format, we really almost had 4 separate school years last year. When we started the school year last year, we started full remote. We brought students back who were comfortable coming back at the end of October, beginning of November. We had students in and out because of quarantines. The rules were different as far as the pandemic. Students were out for quarantine. Students were out because they were in the same 5 feet as somebody else who tested positive. So we had a lot of prolonged staggered absences, a lot of punctuated sort of attendance is what I would call it. And then finally, we opened up for students to come back in person, and it wasn't until May, which would have been after these tests were given. There was a remote option for testing, but that wasn't something that the state was supporting robustly for students who might have still been remote. So what we have here really is a snapshot and even, I would say, a slice of our population represented in this data. There is room for growth. There is room for work. There are some dips that, are a little frightening looking as far as the math scores go. We are doing a lot of work as far as fixing what we've got for our math programs. K through 6 has already been chosen. 7 through 12 is in the process of being changed over, so we're looking to that positively. But I think overall, the trends that you're seeing in our district are the same as the trends you're seeing in the state, and also the trends that you're seeing nationally. National data came back with student scores dropping in all areas. Math was particularly more affected nationally for a lot of reasons. If you're not using the math regularly, you don't have a chance to practice it, you don't get the feedback on it, you're gonna get rusty. So that's our statewide assessment data. The SAT data is on there. Heidi, if you want to speak to that a little bit, the floor is yours.
Just a summary of SAT and TSAT and AP. I can share with you. So I will agree with what Patty said with the numbers of students that are opting out of testing. Parents are able to opt their kids out of the SATs and then they opt them out of the PSAT. So they can with the SAT because it's the state test, and then the PSAT, I think they just kind of agree that that's their plan, is that they're just going to opt their kids out of the testing. So this is just a summary of the last couple of years for our kids. The 2021. Which ones are taking that one? 2020. The 2020 students took the AP exams at home, so they had access to notes and they had access to books and things of that nature. So it doesn't look like it, other than an AP Lit, impacted their scores a whole lot. I think that last year we did see a little bit of a bump with our SAT scores. And that's when we had the SAT prep classes that we had tailored specifically using the PSAT scores from the previous fall. So I think we're planning on doing that again. I've already spoken with Brenda Goodrell, the math intervention person up at the high school. I've also spoken with Heather, and they're both going to kind of create some groups for after the new year, and kids, the juniors, will be doing some intervention groups based on their PSAT scores from this fall for the SAT in the spring. Anything specific you want to ask?
So there'll be I'm just double checking for the purpose of clarification. I think I know the answer to this. I'm under the understanding that we will be having a robust SAT prep program again this year for ELA and math.
Well, yes.
Taking what we did last year and going even deeper because it worked.
Right.
It made a big difference. Instead of going way down in math, we actually stayed somewhat level, which is really surprising.
Yeah, and last year we just focused on math. So this year we're going to take that same model and for ELA as well as math.
And we have the extra time if the kids are in these intervention courses. So we'll be able to really go deep. I'm just hoping that right after break, we're really gonna get right on that and get that up and running, because we've got a golden opportunity to move that forward.
Yeah, pieces of it have already been going. So we have one math interventionist. So a lot of her focus in the fall has been working with groups of 9th and 10th graders that have curriculum gaps. So she's identified them with NEWA scores as to what those gaps are, and she's pulling them out for 6-week units to focus on a particular skill. So we're limited only in some of our staffing, but definitely the SAT in the spring. We're also going to do like an after school version for the kids who want more of like a full SAT prep experience.
I want every kid in the high school on a full SAT prep program.
Well, I mean,
want
like
them
a
to practice. I want them to practice.
We'll have that felt, we're gonna do that, so we basically take what we did last year, and Brenda's been pulling people out, so in 6-week chunks, but around the middle of January, they're gonna be grouped, and they're gonna start being pulled into FLTs for the SAT.
Right, I'm just trying to clarify for the parents in the room and the board members and the folks on the camera that academic intervention is based on your express skills and the holes in your knowledge. That's a year-long process. SAT prep is practicing how to take the SAT with specific skills based on your performance on the PSAT. They're different models. And I don't want anyone to be confused about the difference. And I'm saying now, putting my superintendent, taking off the intervention hat and putting on the superintendent hat, that I want all of our kids to have a rich experience practicing for the SAT with feedback from their PSATs about what to get better at. So I just want to set the expectations super clear while we're right here for EISA and everybody, that that is a very important thing, because I am very happy personally with the fact that we held the line on the math portion, and a big part of that was the SAT prep, because our math curriculum is still unsettled and will be until they choose the 7 to 12 math curriculum and implement it for a year. So that means all of these kids need clear, tight support about what they don't know and are not able to do and how to take the SATs. And that needs to expand to the ELA realm as well with the same intensity and focus. I'm really glad to hear that's what's happening. I just wanted to say it for the camera and for all the people in the room, right, Mr. Stafford? This is what we talk about in admin team meetings, but I'm expressing it just to reaffirm for the community that we're taking this very seriously. And we've also found something that seems to have shown a little bit of light on the problem, and we want to expand on what we have seen be successful.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the SAT benchmark scores, that went from 18% of our kids to 29%, which, I mean, that's a huge.
Huge.
In number of kids who met benchmarks for both. And what we heard from the kids is that they really liked learning how to tackle the problems, because it is definitely a separate skill that, unless you're purposefully taught how to tackle those kind of problems, you don't know how to tackle those kinds of problems. And so what I think, it demystified the test for a lot of kids and just gave them a lot more confidence when we specifically taught.
Hopefully we'll start a prep course for the PSATs eventually, so that you actually do better on those.
PSATs happen pretty early in the year, so that might be a little bit more tricky.
Well, no, if we do it during the freshman year for the sophomore year,
The
then they'll
kids,
be ready for it.
well, the kids take the PSAT in their freshman year as well as their sophomore year.
Right, I would not expect us to prep, well, we could prep in 8th grade, but no, I'm not kidding. It's practicing how to take a test like this is a critical skill for these kids.
Yes.
So we'll talk about that more. Sorry, Gene, you had your hands up.
It's managing pressure also. I have a question just to make sure I'm understanding properly.
Sure.
So the two sets of numbers are different. So this is why this is what I think it's telling me, and I need to know if I'm understanding it correctly. So Dr. Haynes has things broken out by math and ELA. You're giving me SAT school both. So I interpret that 2021 SAT school both at 18% is only 18% of the kids hit competency in both English and math.
Correct.
Whereas if I go to Dr. Haynes' chart and I go to 2021, it says 30% hit competency in math and 61% hit competency in English, but there's not a big intersection of those two sets.
You got it.
And so when I force the two together and say, how did we do on both sets combined? That's when I get the 18. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So then, yeah, 18 to 29 is a huge shift. That's not insignificant in the least. That's huge.
And it shows us that the math is if you learn the skills in math, that they're transferable, but you're more likely to have a problem in math than ELA.
Yep. Yeah, I would expect that by the numbers, the ELA people are getting hammered in math competency.
Well, and
it's driving the whole thing down.
Well, the nice thing is though, is if you're practicing the skills in ELA, it's still the same type of question. So you're getting a double dose of it, one in the context of ELA and one in the context of math. It's the formatting, it's the so many behavioral pieces are in there.
So I'll throw out a perception. I wouldn't even call it an observation, perception. We haven't historically, at least in the recent past, forced pressure-filled activity on the kids because there's always a makeup. You can always come back and get your grade or what have you. Then they get into an SAT and none of that applies. Perform now, do or die. And we haven't been doing that. By giving them the practice, it gets them to step up to the plate and have that experience. And it helps take some of the trepidation away, some of the, oh my God, there's no coming back on this. If the first time you do it is the one that counts, it's a lot more difficult than the first time you do it as practice once.
Agreed.
Any other comments or questions? On the scores or any of either of the score charts here?
How do you talk about the pace, the status of pace, just because I don't think people. As far
We
as
don't
I-
know.
we don't know.
The Department of Ed hasn't shared anything, so we don't know.
We don't know if they're gonna continue the PACE program,
We don't know what's going on with it.
which means if we switch to the NHSAS, we need to also plan for teaching students the skills for that test. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Yep.
It's just, it's another transition, and every time you make a transition, it seems small on the surface, but it's a huge splay out of change in instruction and practices that we have to be aware of. When you change your assessments, you organically change your teaching. My God, I hate these classes, just for the record. Anyway, keep going.
Okay, next. Reading.
So grading, for today's topic on grading, we're going to be talking about how the grades are being reported in the report cards and an explanation of what decaying average means and some examples. And for that, I'm going to turn to Mr. Stack, who's got some excellent examples. And he'll be able to walk us through what's happening with that.
I've got my car keys ready.
So okay, so let me pass this out. So everybody always asks, what is this decaying average? How does this work? What is it? How does it work? I put together some examples to try to help walk you through the math behind the decaying average, because I think that's where people get the most tripped up. Everybody knows how an average works, right? You have 10 items, you add them all up, you divide the total by 10. That tells you on average how you do. So a decaying average is sort of that next level approach. It's based on the idea that as you're learning a new skill, you're expecting that you're going to need some ramp up time to get better at that skill, but ultimately it's the end of the year scores on that skill that's a better indicator of to what extent you've learned something. So, thanks, sir. So with the decaying average, and there are other ways to do this, but with the decaying average calculation in the grade book for Alma, that's a way that you can give credit, so to speak, for some of those more recent scores. So what I did here is I gave you 3 different examples. These are 3 different students, and in all 3 of the examples, the student, what we're trying to show is what would happen if there was a traditional average and what would happen if there was a decaying average. So the first example is a student who has that slow start, right? They sort of ramp up over time and their scores improve from, they start with 2s and then they get a 3 and then they're getting a 4. In the next example, and it's the exact same process, you have a student who's kind of like they have ups and downs. They're not really showing a sign that they're getting better or worse. They're sort of living in the 3 and 2 range. And then the last example is a student who's actually on a downward trend. So this is a student who actually found the learning to be really easy when perhaps the material or the depth at which the material was being presented was a little bit easier to understand. But then as the material got more challenging, their learning trajectory was not increasing with that challenge level. It was actually going in the other direction. So as you look at these different examples, and I'll give you some time to read it. I'm not going to read it out to you. What I want to point out to you is that a decaying average actually works on the idea that it's like an iteration, if you're familiar with that term in mathematics. So if you have one score, it does one thing. If you add a second score, it takes the previous result and then does something new. If you add a third score, it takes your previous result from the first 2, and then it does something to add a third. So if you look at example number 1, let's just walk through that front example. All right. So in this decaying average example, we're going to use 50% as the weight for the most recent work. That is a variable that gets set by whomever is going to set it. So right at Sanborn this year, we're using 50% as our number. So when you get your first score, you got a 2 on the assignment, that's what you have. You have a 2. When you go to get the second score, which also happened to be a 2, the first half of your weight came from that original 2. That's why it's in red. The second half of your score came from your latest score, and that's how you got your new grade, which, duh, it's still a 2, but your first 2 assignments were 2, so that should make sense. Now it starts to get a little trickier, right? When you drop down to that next score, the third score, which also happened to be a 2, it's taking 50% of the previous number, and then you're getting 50% weight for the new number. Okay, we're still at 2. That should be no surprise, right? All right, but now drop down to that next score. The orange 2, when it comes down as score 4, is 50%. And now you scored a 3, and that's getting 50%. So your new grade has gone up to a 2.5. And then when you drop down to that last level, half of your score comes from that green 2.5. The other half of your score comes from the new grade. Does that make sense? That's the math behind what's
Brian,
happening.
I'm just gonna say honestly, I get so confused with this, and it could just be that my brain can't process it.
It might.
But I feel like if I were a kid in school and you tried to explain this to me in 9th grade, I would be like, holy smoke, but I'm gonna hang with you because I'm listening very carefully.
So if you don't want to get, so here's the problem. We have a couple of kinds of kids. We have kids who definitely dive into the numbers and they want to know everything happening behind the scenes to
Yeah.
predict, right?
Yeah.
So these charts are super helpful for them.
Yep.
And then we have other kids that just want to know, is this better or worse than what would have happened if you just averaged? So that you can see right away just by looking at what happened if you use the traditional average or not. So for example number 1, in a traditional average, the student would have scored a 2.6. That's a straight average, 2, 2, 2, 3, and 4, 2.6. Using this decaying average, the student ended up with a 3.25. So if you think about the trend, what does that tell you? They started with some 2s, then they got a 3, then they got a 4. They're sort of getting some credit for the fact that their scores were improving, and the 3.25 is more indicative of where they ended their learning, not how their learning looked as a summary of the whole year. Do you follow? If you look at examples 2 and 3, you can follow that exact, you don't have to go through all the details in the math, but look what happens here, right? The traditional average is 2.6, but the decaying average isn't much different. It's only 2.69. Well, what were those scores? It was hovering around a 3, a 2, a 3, a 2. It actually ended with a 3. So it ended on a bit of an upswing. And so your decaying average ended up on a bit of an upswing higher than what it would have been otherwise. The last example, and this is where the point is, shows you what happens when you have a student who's on a downward trend, right? So here's a student who, again, same average, the grades average to a 2.6, but because their grades started to go down, they end up with a 2.25 as their overall grade with the decaying average. Again, more indicative of where they're at in their learning. So if you think about when you're doing a course over the course of a year, the material might start at a very basic introductory level, and slowly as the year progresses, your goal is to start to challenge students to go further and deeper with some of that material. And this student struggled with some of that. And the grade accurately reports that at the end, they were not as competent, so to speak, as what they were in the beginning. So that's the math behind the process. That's what I was asked to explain to you guys tonight. Just to give you a sense, because I do think the questions come up. Why do we do this? Wouldn't it be a lot easier to use an average, to your point, Tom? And it is, it's a fair question. But like I said, that starting point is that there's a logic that the more recent learning is going to be more indicative of where they're at today. So that when we're planning intervention and next steps for them, it's going to help us make some of those right decisions for them and help them fill in some of the gaps along the way. It's not a new thing for us to be using this idea of more recent work. It is a new thing for us to be doing a decaying average. So if we go into the Wayback Machine with Pinnacle, when we started Pinnacle 10 years ago, we'll say 10 years ago, because I don't remember exactly what it was. Pinnacle had a similar feature. It was called a learning trend. Pinnacle was a little bit more, actually, they were a lot more dynamic than Alma was, in the sense that they would actually, the program was built so that student by student, it would either use an average or use a learning trend for that student. And the way the program would decide which one to use is when you had at least four scores that were different for that particular skill. Because if you had less than 4 scores, using the trend wouldn't make sense, because the learning trend calculation that it was using was a power law.
Yep.
Which, if you look it up, is a really fancy function that I'm definitely not going to get into the math to on that tonight. But it would be more of a predictor. Think of it like when you would be in math and you would be coming up with a line of best fit or a curve of best fit. That's kind of what a power law would be predicting. So it needed to have at least 4 scores that were enough of a variable so that it could actually make a prediction of what you should do. So that's what we used to use. Switching to Alma, that wasn't an option, and it also may not have been an option that we wanted to pursue, but we did have a couple of different options for how we set it up. Decaying average seemed to be the way to go, where we've, I think, I don't want to say struggled, but I think where we've had internal debates is what we felt was a reasonable number to use for that decay. Because I gave you an example with 50% is the decay number, right? Because that's what we're using this year. Well, these examples would look very different if we had used 30% or 20% or 80%, right? So the math is here. You can follow the math. You would have to change the numbers to see what some of those outcomes would look like. So I don't know if that made you more confused or less confused, but I put it out there anyway.
So I understand the math. I'm more concerned with the philosophy than the math.
Sure.
Because like you're saying, in 50%, 30%, 80% changes the numbers dramatically. My concern is, and I don't know what my opinion is on it yet, but my concern is just, talking off the top of my head here. It does tell people that what you did at the beginning of the year is not as important. And if we inculcate that into a thought process that what I did at the beginning of the year is not as important, then we might be causing ourselves further problems as we go forward, because they're not getting the building blocks at the beginning of the year because they think that it's not going to work. And then they're going to have difficulty at the end of the year because they didn't put in the time at the beginning of the year in order to get the basis that they want. So that would be one thing I could think of that says, geez, there might be some inherent items here that should be discussed and truly understood. I do understand the way that the math is working out, that, okay, so again, take my example and use it theoreticals on that. I can't do better in those later years if I just did what I defined some student might do, because I'm not going to be in a position to do that.
Right.
In which case, those people that are struggling are going to be penalized because your third example, because they're coming down and they really did do the work and they're coming down. So I guess I'm not for it or against it at this point in time, but I've not seen this done before.
Sure.
I've not, it's never been explained to me in this manner so that I could understand what's happening. But I do have some concerns as to what exactly are the incentives that we're building in, and how is that going to play out with the kids? Are there districts that do this now? Are you using decay curves?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, there definitely are. And I think,
Which districts?
oh, I mean, there's lots of districts. I could poll districts if you want folks that are doing it. I know
Pembroke is using this. I know, oh gosh, which one is that? Is it Monadnock or Kearsarge, one of those up in that area? So, yeah,
I'm gonna do something extremely rare. I'm gonna ask for a motion to go into non-public because I want to say some things that I feel could harm the reputation of some people who are not in the room.
That's not
I'm gonna call Dan and have him come shut it off.
Okay.
If you don't want to, we don't have to. We can talk about it for the next meeting,
I
but
think one of us.
I've never done this before,
Alright,
but
so
I'm-
I'll make a motion to go into non-public for RSA
93 colon, and then there's a
Colon.
number. And
Two,
hey,
yeah, whatever they are. I got part of it.
all right, I'll call Dan.
Okay, I will entertain a motion to establish a grading task force.
So moved.
Second, consisting of Patty, Tom, Brian, and Dawn as our subcommittee liaison. Okay, you moved, you seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right. So do we have enough time to address the remaining items in our agenda, or are we?
I think my suggestion would be table the NEASC update because we'll just do that next time. We've got more time, but I think Matt has a quick update for the high school schedule committee.
Okay,
Yeah, the high school schedule and graduation committee was supposed to have met last Thursday, but about 40% of the members couldn't meet, so we bumped the meeting till tomorrow. So we will have 2 meetings prior to the next EISA meeting, so we'll have a very detailed update in a month.
Thank you.
okay. All right, so our next agenda will be our NEASC update and the high school schedule committee update. Anything else?
Report out about the grading progress. I don't know how much we'll get between now and then with the holiday, but I'd like to have that be a standing agenda item, please, so that we can continue this discussion.
Anything else I need to know about right now? Otherwise, let me know. Our next meeting is scheduled for January 19th. And we are adjourned.